Hello friends, let's talk about budget speakers. Today I had the Nume BS-5 passive speaker and the much beloved, at least by the budget audiophile community, Sony SS-CS5. I bought this one myself, paid 88 bucks, shipped for it during Black Friday. I think typical MSRP, or maybe not MSRP, typical sale prices, about 130 bucks from Amazon. And for the Neumi, the typical sale price is $109. And I actually got this pair on loan from Neumi directly. And the reason for that is because last year I tested the Nume BS-5 when it first came out. And I was really, truly impressed by the performance. But things have changed with my setup, obviously. I've got the clippable near field scanner now, which is a much higher resolution and more accurate way of measuring speakers. That doesn't change my assessment about the sound profiles, but it does give me an even apples to apples way to compare what I still consider probably the better of budget speakers versus something like this, a newer speaker that I've measured, or something I've measured this year and going forward. So I actually reached out to Neumi and asked them if they would be willing to set me up with a pair, and I don't know if they're gonna let me keep them, but if they do, you guys know that's not how I roll, so I'm not getting paid for any of this stuff. If they do let me keep them, I'll throw them up on my Patreon. So if you're interested, I do that kind of thing now and again, where if I'm given something to review, very rarely am I given something, but if I am, then I give it away. I don't keep anything and I don't sell anything. So I'm just putting that out there. I want everybody to know up front the origin of these speakers. But yep, I paid for these myself. I was loaned these from Neumi. And overall impressions, I like the Neumi, okay? The Neumi speaker has lower sensitivity than the Sony. That matters to you. Hold on. Hair in my mouth. That matters to you because most people watching this video and that are interested in these two speakers are going to be likely driving them with an AVR. I doubt seriously that you're going to try to power them with a separate external amplifier. And therefore you want something that has moderate sensitivity and can be driven by an AVR. Both of these speakers can be driven by an AVR, but this one will get a little bit louder. I want to say it's got about 3 dB higher sensitivity, and we'll talk about that when we get to the data. And by the way, if you haven't watched my channel before, heads up, I do a lot of objective-based discussion on speakers and their performance, because when you start talking about subjective likes, dislikes, some of those can vary from person to person. But more importantly, what do some of these nebulous words mean to you, to me? They may not mean the same thing. So everything is backed up with objective data, and you can at any time go and check out the data on my website. So let's go ahead and take a look a little bit more at the Neumi. It is a smaller bookshelf speaker, as you can see, at least height-wise. Both of them have a grill, so I'll pop the grills off. And you got a 1-inch dome tweeter. I think it's a 5 1/4 inch mid-woofer in the Neumi, and it's got front ports here, nominal 6 ohm rating, and the binding post on the back. Not a lot fancy about it, but personally speaking, I actually like the looks over the Sony. And you may be wondering why. Well, let me show you why. The grill, remove the grill, and then you got this, and I just don't like the look of the speaker. I really don't. I personally just not a fan. So if you like the sort of flash that it has, then hey, kudos to you. The Sony has, I think, again, it's probably a 5 or a 5 1/4 inch mid-woofer, what is this, maybe like a 1-inch dome tweeter. All the specs you can look up. I'm not talking about specs. I'm talking about actual performance. And then it's got this super tweeter, which gives it that high-res sound. Okay, first of all, high-res sound to me is just total BS. Hearing above 20 kilohertz and having a tweeter that can play to 40 kilohertz, who gives a flying fart? You can't hear above 20K. The majority of people in the world can't hear above 20K. Most of the people in the audio community have started to lose their hearing a little bit to some degree, and some of them can't hear above 12, 16K. So why do we care about the marketing terms, which that's really what they are, let's be honest, they're marketing terms, of a super tweeter? It's not needed in my opinion. It's kind of a waste of money. And I think the design could have been better, which I do have some data to kind of back that up a little bit without the super tweeter. With that said, a lot of people like it. And hey, 88 bucks, Black Friday sale price. I mean, you got to start somewhere, right? That's the thing about this hobby. And that's the thing about objective measurements that I try not to overlook. I mean, sometimes it's easy to fall into the trap of, well, this doesn't look great on paper, but you've got to start somewhere. My first system was, I mean, my first like real hi-fi system was a set of $300, what, Perion audio, however you want to pronounce it. And I bought that about, man, it's probably been 13, 14 years, maybe 15 years since I bought that. By today's standards, they probably would be maybe hot garbage, but back then, you know, I wanted something that I could be proud of. And when you don't have a lot of money, you know, you search for the best thing that you can find. So that's really what this kind of review is going to be about, you know, my comparison between these two speakers. Now, the things that I think that you might like about the Sony is it does have a little bit more of a boosted top end. I mean, that super tweeter does help the upper octave above like 10, 15 kilohertz or so up to 20. And yeah, it could play higher, but you can't hear above that. So we won't get into that. Whereas this tweeter on the Neumi, it can play high, but it just doesn't have that bump up like the Sony does. The thing I really do like about the Neumi, and make it clear that I do like the fact that it doesn't have the rise in the Neumi. I don't necessarily care for the upper treble boost of the Sony, and really any other tweeter that has that characteristic is just not something that I'm fond of. But the other thing that I really think the Neumi has going for it is that it has a little bit more bass output. I want to say the F3 point, which means its point where it starts really rolling off, is about 15 hertz or so lower. I don't remember the numbers, but we're going to get into that in a little bit. So this speaker does play lower, whereas this one doesn't really play much below about 100 hertz. I mean, it starts rolling off a little bit below that point, and this one gets a little bit lower. So I think, you know, if you don't have a subwoofer, if you're looking for something that gets down into a decent mid-bass area, this absolutely is the breadwinner there. This one is not. The front ports on this speaker allow you to place it near a wall. That means that you could theoretically do that. I just hit the wall. Don't tell my wife. That would boundary load the woofer portion of it, and that would give you a little bit more output. Whereas the rear port on this speaker, you can't do that because then you'd block that rear port and then it would just roll off even sooner. Let's see here. They both have a mid-range dip in response. The thing about the Neumi is that it is not quite as linear through the mid-range as the Sony, meaning that there is a dip of about maybe 5 dB where it kind of troughs off between the, is it maybe 1 kilohertz area, somewhere in that area. And again, we'll talk about that in the data a little bit. But, you know, just overall, my upfront impressions of it is that within their budget range, I still think the Neumis are probably the class leader. It's not perfect. And as far as, you know, audiophile quality, I dare even say maybe it's not perfect by a long shot, but it's $109 a pair. It used to be $90 a pair. They've gone up in price, and I wish they had maintained a way not to do that or stayed like $99, because then it would be no doubt the best one that I think you can get. But even at $109, I still think it's probably one of the better deals. $109 shipped to your door from Amazon Prime. It's hard to beat that. And when you're done with them, you can give them to your kid or your brother-in-law. Maybe buy these and give them to your brother-in-law, you know, if you're not fond of them, something like that. I shouldn't say that. I know some of these people out there have the speaker and they love it. I'm just kidding. I'm just giving some folks a hard time. The one thing I do want to mention, though, about this speaker is that it does have a little bit of a waveguide on the dome tweeter, which is kind of nice. It helps dispersion a little bit. And the tweeter here does also have a little bit of a waveguide as well. So as far as acoustics go, you know, the performance of the tweeter area is reasonable. But again, you get what you pay for. So I'm going to quit my yapping here. We're going to look at the data and do some side-by-side comparisons, and then give you better indication of what you can get out of these speakers and help you make a more informed purchase. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to hit the high points because this video could be a lot longer than it really needs to be. And I just really kind of want to guide you into what the data shows and what that says to me about the overall performance of these two speakers. First off, we're going to start with the Nume BS-5. Now, this is the CEA 2034 dataset. And what we're really looking for here is just linearity in the black on-axis response and even in the dashed listening window response. We want to see if they're kind of linear in response. And what we see here is a bit of a trough through the mid-range on the Neumi. A major suck out. Now, this is caused by the, well, we back up. This is
Probably caused by the enclosure itself. Could be caused by port resonance. It's really hard to know for sure, but the problem really turns its head because with a front port, and I've always seen this. I mean, maybe there's an exception to the rule, but every time that I've seen a resonance show up from a front port, it shows up as a dip in the response. Whereas a resonance from the enclosure or leaking out of the enclosure, but leaking out through a rear port, shows up as a boost in the response. And usually that boost in response maybe isn't so bad. And it's certainly not to the level that a dip on axis in the response, or I should say a dip in the frontal hemisphere, shows up from the front placed port. And it just really looks bad. But the thing to keep in mind about this is that it's a really, really narrow Q. It's certainly really deep, but the ability of you to hear it to where it's problematic, I don't think is so much of an issue. Now, if this were reversed and it were a peak like that, then I'd say, yeah, this speaker is off the table. But because it's a dip, it's not going to present itself to you as shouty. It may just result in something missing a little bit in that region, maybe some, I don't know, maybe some clarity or maybe some attack or something like that. But odds are you may not even miss it. But I still think it's worth noting and maybe trying to understand a little bit. Now, if we go a little bit higher in frequency, we see the same thing. So what I'm thinking is that you probably got a mode from the height of the cabinet and then a mode from the width of the cabinet. And that's responsible for these two dips on axis, or I should say that's responsible for these two dips that we're seeing here. And it's because those modal issues are leaking out through that front port. Having said that, when you go to the higher frequencies, it actually looks pretty good. You've got a resonance right here around, what is that, maybe 6 kilohertz, maybe 7 kilohertz, somewhere in this area. And I can say that, it didn't stand out to me as problematic. And then you go on a little bit higher in frequency and it's not super linear, but overall for the price that you're paying, I'm willing to accept it. Okay. I'll just say that I'm willing to accept it. If you've got $600 and you're looking to get a speaker set, don't buy this one, get you something else. But if you've got about $100 and you really are trying to watch your budget, but you really want to get started off in this hobby, the Neumi's a good option. Now going on to the Sony, let's see what it does. Okay, well, the first thing we notice right away, look at the low end. The Sony does not have the same low end as the Neumi. So the Neumi has better bass than the Sony. Now we're going up a little bit higher. We're not seeing dips in the response, but what we're seeing is some peakiness, okay? And that's going to be the same issue that was caused by the Neumi. It's likely just internal cabinet volume issues, some kind of standing waves or something like that inside the cabinet is causing the enclosure to ring. The port's on the back, so it's not going to show up as a dip, so we get a boost in the response. Now going higher in frequency, you see you've got a dip around this 3 kilohertz region. Do you have that in the Neumi? No, you don't. Going up, you see a boost and then a dip. And so these, to me, are likely crossover issues between the mid-range to tweeter to super tweeter. And that's why I made the comment earlier that probably the super tweeter isn't really helping a lot. And I think the speaker would probably be better, be better without the super tweeter and just a redesigned crossover. I think maybe Sony was just going for that marketing aspect of, hey, we've got this high resolution tweeter that will play to frequencies that only aliens can hear with supersonic radar detection properties or something. Who knows? I don't know. But you can see again that really the point being the Neumi is more linear in response. Now, the Neumi has a little bit lower sensitivity. Overall, maybe about a dB to 2 dB, maybe 2 dB if you're really looking at that mid-range area. And you can see that the Neumi kind of has a little bit less energy down in the mid-range than it does in the treble region. So if you just draw an imaginary line, you can see it's about a dB or so off, whereas the Sony doesn't really have that, but the Sony has more non-linearity. The other thing to note here is that the directivity index, just how the speaker behaves all around it, and also mainly in the frontal hemisphere covered by this set of data down here, doesn't look great, but really, again, it's caused by this dip on axis. If you didn't have this dip on axis, and if it were maybe parked to the back, you would have some bumps here instead of these significant dips. So if I just imaginarily, I think I made that word up, go through this, I can say, okay, it's kind of clean. And then we get to the tweeter area. Yeah, there's a directivity mismatch between the tweeter and the mid-range because it dips in directivity, and then it starts to rise again as the tweeter becomes more narrow in dispersion. What about the Sony? Well, the Sony has much cleaner directivity index, but it doesn't have that front port issue, so it looks cleaner. But you do have a peak right through here, and then a dip where it has a mismatch to that tweeter. But the super tweeter looks like it probably has a good match in the crossover region, depending on exactly where it's crossed over at. So I would say that the crossover between the tweeter and the super tweeter is maybe okay, all things considered, but I do still think that the super tweeter is probably causing more harm than good. All right, now let's look at estimated in-room response. This is a guide to what the speaker will sound like in your room. Ideally, you want a speaker that is sloping off in response, because a speaker that is flat in the estimated room response is going to sound bright. So this speaker is likely going to sound a bit bright to some people. Now, I didn't really notice that so much, but honestly, I was more or less listening for this area to see if it really bothered me. So maybe don't take my word for it at this point in time with this, but the Sony, I did hear it. You know, it definitely, again, you got this peak, dip, peak, and then this right here bothered me. I would say that if you're watching this and you're wondering, you know, hey, I think the Sony may look better for some reason or another, they're cheap enough. Buy both of them, try them out in your room, see which one you like. That's my honest opinion. If you only have money to get one or the other, then I'm going to default to the Neumi, just because I feel like it's the better product. And it's not because they loaned it out to me. It has nothing to do with that. Actually, if you use my affiliate links, I think the Sony costs a little bit more. So if that were true, I would probably encourage you to get the Sony, but I like the Neumi more. So there you go. Now let's talk about horizontal radiation. The horizontal radiation pattern, I'm really looking at this red area. What's the width of the radiation look like for the Neumi? It's about plus or minus 50 degrees, which is, I'd say it's kind of like in the median range for wide speaker. I think the KEF speakers that I've tested in the past have been about that, and I say it's not too wide, but it's acceptable. I, generally speaking, like a speaker with a little bit more width through the mid-range. I would say 60 to 70 degrees is what I like, but these things matter to you because it's up to your room, and it's just generally up to your personal preference. So this is where you need to understand how the data relates to what you hear. And that's why I would encourage you, when you buy one of these speakers, if you buy one of these speakers, come back and look at the data and see if you can make some correlations like I'm trying to do to help you understand what it means. Now we're going to switch over to the Sony. Sony is more narrow in dispersion, so that may be one reason why I didn't really care for the Sony. Could certainly have something to do with it. Going back to the Neumi, yeah, you can see it's just wider in dispersion. Now, you may be wondering, why is there more red in this lower region? Well, it's just because it's in higher SPL. So this is all SPL based, so the higher output the speaker has, the more red is going to be there. And we know that previously the Sony has more output in that lower mid-range area versus the Neumi. So that's why the Neumi is not in red right through here, whereas the Sony is. But the overall width profile of the Sony is about plus or minus 40 degrees, and then it narrows up to about plus or minus 30 degrees right through here, whereas the Neumi is about plus or minus 50 degrees, excepting for these dips. And then we narrow to about plus or minus 35 or so degrees in the upper octave. So that's one thing I do like about the Neumi as well. Before I go on to another comparison, real fast, I wanted to point out the influence of this super tweeter. So the super tweeter is measured in blue. Now this is the near field response with the microphone placed really close to the speaker, and it's not indicative of the sum total of the speaker as you're far away from it, but it just kind of gives us an idea of what each component, like the tweeter, the super tweeter, the mid-range, and the port, how they influence the overall sound when you're in the far field or sitting further away from the speaker. And we can see that the super tweeter adds some flare at around 16 kilohertz or so, and then it drops off. Now, this right here may be more catching of the super or the other tweeter. So I would ignore this down here below about the 8 kilohertz region. But I would say that, yeah, the super tweeter is just adding a little bit more, and it's a super tweeter. Then we go and look at some of these other peaks and dips from the port. So we see a peak around 500 hertz. We see one around 1K, and we see one around 1.5K. Keep this in mind. Remember earlier I said that I don't know if it's the port itself or if it's a standing wave in the enclosure. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to that. Now let's compare distortion. This is at 96 dB at 1 meter. I think that's a pretty good output. And if you're trying to use these as like a home theater speaker, you're going to need to use the subwoofer for sure. But this gives us an idea of where the speaker really starts to lose its composure. And let's see. So for the Neumi, 3% THD is the negative 30 dB mark down here. So it's not quite cleared that at 96 dB until you go below about 80 hertz. And then the woofer starts to give up the ghost. Okay. Then we go to the Sony. The Sony barely touches around the mid-range, but the actual higher frequencies looks better than the Neumi. Then we just ramp up on the low end. So I would call distortion wise, I'm going to kind of call this a wash. They both have some characteristics of them that make you go, how audible are they going to be? I don't know. The more important stuff is the compression. The compression gives us an idea of how much output the speaker can have and still remain dynamic. So I started a low volume and then I ramped the volume up. And then anytime that you see any of these color lines deviate from this flat 0 dB, that means they are losing output down here, or above the 0 dB line, they're gaining output due to distortion. And what we can see with the Neumi is that at really high output volumes of 102 dB, you start to lose output pretty good bit, especially in the bass region. At more moderate volumes, 86 dB, 96 dB, it's reasonable. So now we'll switch over to the Sony. And we can see the Sony is doing some crazy stuff. It ramps up like crazy on the low end. And that's really because the output there is so low and level. I mean, it's fallen like a rock, as we saw earlier. It falls off at a much higher frequency than the Neumi does. So it's going to have more inherent distortion as you go lower and lower in frequency. Therefore, obviously, again, use a subwoofer and use a proper crossover. The other things about this, though, it's if we look at 100 hertz and above, it's really not too much different from the Neumi. I mean, the Neumi certainly looks more well composed. Oh, wow. Yeah, scratch that. The Sony has some serious issues going on 100, 150 hertz. And then it's got some kind of, that's distortion from the tweeter to the mid right here. Go back to the Neumi. The Neumi suffers compression. But the thing that I'm liking about the Neumi is it's more linear. I mean, it's not perfect. None of these lines are flat, but generally speaking, compared to the Sony, these are a little bit more smooth. I mean, they're contoured roughly the same, whereas the Sony is just bouncing around and doing some crazy stuff all over the place. Neither one of them really win, but the Neumi performs better in that regard. An additional measurement I did was to stuff the ports of the Neumi just to see what happens. And when you do that, you drop the little boost from the port on the mid bass around 100 hertz, so it levels it out. And then it really makes that mismatch between the mid-range to the mid-bass more apparent in here. So you got about a 5 dB step, which is not really great. You still got that cabinet resonance, but the thing that you're noticing here is there's no dips. Why are there no dips? Well, you've got the cabinet resonance, but it's contained inside the enclosure. So it's radiating, but it's not radiating out through that front port, causing an on-axis phase rotation, which results in the dip in sound, or the dip in response. So that's why you don't have that dip, but you still got that resonance. And initially, what my recommendation was to stuff the ports and put them against a wall, because when you put them against a wall around 300 hertz or so, they're going to couple to the wall very, very well, and it's going to bring this up by about 6 dB, give or take. You're still going to be left with a little bit of a trough through here, but I think it's going to be not as bad. Certainly not as bad as it is right now. I think overall, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think your overall result is going to be much better if you take the Nume BS-5, put it against a wall, and stuff those ports. You can use a sock. I don't have one around here. A rag, whatever, but just stuff something inside of those ports, seal those ports up, and you'll get a better response. And push it against the wall. That'll boundary load it, give you a little bit more bass, smooth that transition through the mid-range right through here so you won't have such a steep step. That's my opinion. Or my recommendation. I talked to you about the cabinet resonances. So what I did was I strapped an accelerometer to the side of the Sony, and I measured the cabinet itself just to see, is there a ringing in the cabinet? Sure enough, this indicates that there is some kind of ringing right around maybe that's 1.6 kilohertz or so. And that's that one peak we saw in the data. And then if we go to the accelerometer on the top, we can see that there is a much stronger resonance at about 1 kilohertz. And I'm going to go pull that data up again real fast. And here we have the Sony again. So this is the same data that you saw earlier, but I really want to kind of make the point of that strong resonance is showing up right here. That's the peaking that is caused by the resonance inside the cabinet. And then there was another resonance right through here, and it's not showing up as strongly. Maybe it's this little guy right there. So I'm not picking on the Sony. I could have done this with the Neumi. I just didn't. This is really just to hammer home the fact of it's not the port, it's the cabinet, and it's the sound leaking through the port that's causing some of these issues to be measured at the port. And again, on the Sony, at the front of it is causing a dip in response. So fix your cabinets, guys, and y'all be good to go. And that's it for this review. I hope you learned something. I hope you appreciate it. If you are interested in buying either of these speakers, after this review, if you want to help the channel out, I'll drop some affiliate links down below for Amazon. Overall, my impression again really is I like the Neumi more. I think the Sony is okay for a budget speaker, but I think the Neumi is more linear. I say stuff the port on the Neumi, put it against a wall. Why don't I say stuff the port on the Sony? Because the bass is already rolling off so fast anyway, I don't think it's going to matter. And really the problem with the Sony for me is that even if it had good bass, you've still got that non-linearity in the upper frequencies that I just don't care for. So with that said, I am out. I hope you have a good one. Talk to y'all later. Peace.